Hello and welcome to another episode of A God Shift. I am your host, Shayna Rattler. Thank you so much for being here. But before we get started, I would love to ask you for a favor. I want you to take a screenshot of wherever it is that you are listening to this episode. And with that screenshot, I want you to do a couple of things. Post it on your social media and tag us here at A God Shift. And then I just want to hear your biggest aha moment or your biggest takeaway from this episode, because the more times this message gets shared, the more people can recognize that there's hope on the other side of what it is that they're going through, and that there's God in the middle of what it is that they're going through. So I appreciate you taking the time to do that. I am going to read part of my guest's bio, and then we're going to get into a conversation that I've been really looking forward to having. So my guest today was an agnostic police officer for 26 years, where he was exposed to many traumatic incidents. He was diagnosed with PTSD and then with an incurable, debilitating neuromuscular disease. After an attempted suicide, he made some very poor decisions that led him to a 14-year prison sentence. God placed people in his life to teach him the gospel, and he co-pastored the church in prison. He is now an addiction counselor, chaplain, and a Christian mental health coach, specializing in trauma with the intent to start a first responder ministry. He wrote a book called Christ-Centered Healing of Trauma, Healing a Broken Heart, and a small group study guide. I want to welcome to the show, Norm Wielsch.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm really happy to have this conversation with you. I come from a long family of law enforcement. My uncle was the very first Black police officer in my small hometown growing up. My dad was a prison guard for 13 years. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation so that we can actually have the opportunity to see what's possible on the other side of someone making a mistake or having a bad moment or whatever it is that all of us have done. Most of us just haven't been caught. That's what I like to say. All of us have done something we should be in jail for. Most of us just didn't get caught. But
well,
I want to say,
guilt, so thank you.
Yeah, I want to lay a little bit of foundation for the conversation, Norm. So it's called a God shift. And my definition of a God shift is the moment a disruption in your life collides with God's purpose, but then that moves you into greater dimensions of possibility. I think that anytime we are putting energy into something that is not on the path that God has planned for us, he's so committed to his results in our lives that he's going to use whatever it is that he knows it will take in order to get our attention. Then obviously, once he has our attention, that's when he can invite us into what it is that he really has planned for us. So I've talked about a lot. There was even some stuff in the bio that I didn't read because I didn't want to spill all the beans for the story. But I would love if you would just share a little bit with the audience about a disruption that you've had to overcome in order to get to where you are today.
Oh, well, it's long. I'm going to try to put it in a little nutshell. But so I was a cop for 26 years. About 12 years in, I really started to suffer from severe depression. I've been through a lot of traumas, a lot of death, a lot of child abuse, stuff like that I had to be part of. Now, I'm not any different than any other officer. I'm not trying to say that I'm special or I experience stuff that this is what cops go through daily, and I'm talking about just traffic accidents where children are hurt or killed. Train accidents. One of my worst ones was a plane accident that killed 14 people and injured like 70, so it's just these things. And because of the police culture, they don't allow time to process these things, right? Mm-hmm. So you see these horrific things, and then a half hour later, you get called to a call where you might just have a noise complaint, stereo or something. They don't, or they didn't back then allow any time to process. I understand that things are changing, but some of the guys I talked to said it's still, because you have to have this warrior mentality, right? And I'm going to include for all first responders, I'm going to include emergency room doctors, nurses, and paramedics, because they all see these things, and if you have to compartmentalize it and just move forward, it's really detrimental to your well-being, right? And in these cultures, you have to have this warrior mentality where you can't admit that you're suffering. You can't admit that you're in pain. If I would have went to my superiors at that time, and this was going to be in the mid 90s, and say, hey, I'm really considering suicide. I really need to talk to somebody. They would send me to a city doctor, right? Paid by them. And then the first thing I would say is, I'm really having a tough time, difficult time. And they would take my gun, take my badge, and put me off duty. And then everybody in the department would know nobody would ever work with me again. And that's unfortunately the reality. And
it would do nothing but make the problem worse.
Of course, and I see this in veterans all the time where, they come forward and admit that they're suffering. They take their security clearances away. It's just, we're not handling mental illness the way we should. Now, there is a movement now to change that, but it's a slow movement, right? Because I can't fault them, because you have to be tough, right? You have to be mentally strong. If you see something horrific, you can't just stand there and cry about it. You have to deal with the situation. But the problem becomes when it's all these cumulative traumas just add up, and pretty soon there's just no way out. So I was suffering with severe depression. And then in 1999, I got diagnosed with this. It's called peripheral neuropathy. It's similar to what diabetics have. I don't have that, but so that's a deadening of the nerves in the extremities. And then that was complicated by a muscle disease called Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, which is the atrophy of the muscles in the extremities.
Yeah.
So what was happening is I was developing these ulcers, or big giant blisters, on the bottom of my feet, and they weren't healing. So eventually I got some infections and stuff. And in a 10-year period, I had over 30 surgeries. And that brought out a lot of the PTSD symptoms. I think the stress of going through that really brought out these other symptoms. When I was at home, I was having panic attacks, I was really hypervigilant, all these different symptoms came out. And I noticed that the doctors would give you opioids after a surgery, right? Yeah. So, and they just fill you up. And I'm not blaming the doctors for anything. They have a responsibility to remove the pain. But I ended up realizing that these opioids numbed my emotions, right? Wow. So I didn't feel all these things that I didn't want to feel. It's kind of stopped all these intrusive thoughts and these images that I was going through. And then I would have nightmares. So I would they would take Ambien to help me with that. But the Ambien made everything worse, so.
It's like problem, solution. You have one thing to fix a problem, and then that creates another problem. And it's just, where does it stop?
Exactly. You put yourself in a cycle. Now, at that time, I didn't believe in God. I grew up in a Christian home, but we only went to church maybe on Easter, and that was it, right? So I didn't know God. And by the things that I've seen, I couldn't believe that there was a kind and loving God. So I was far away from him. And of course, this medication is sinful. And so I was going really against God, right? And then when you go into a cycle of depression and stuff, you start developing what's called inner vows. Like, you promise yourself that you're never going to get hurt by somebody. So you push yourself away, you start isolating. And that's also sinful, because that goes against God's will too. So most of the time, I'm not going to say everybody, but most of the time when people have these mental illness issues, they treat them in a sinful manner. Normally alcohol, drugs, gambling, overspending. It could even be overworking at the church. It could be a lot of different things. You don't live that balanced lifestyle. So I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I was addicted to the opioids. And then in about 2008, I lost my mom. 2009, my daughter, who was 24 at the time, got diagnosed with some liver tumors.
Wow.
And that was like the last straw, because that was my little girl, and they told me that the surgery would be a 50-50 survival, mm-hmm. And I just went off the deep end, and the drug use got worse, and it's all pills. I never used anything illegal. Not that it matters, but I mean, it was just the pills. And so then the suicide attempts came after that, and I'm grateful that God prevented me from doing that.
Yeah.
And then I ended up making some severe mistakes by stealing some drugs out of our evidence to give it to a friend of mine who was doing financial problems. It was methamphetamine. I never touched methamphetamine, but I did do that. And I was just, I think when looking back now, I think it was a self-destructive act I couldn't commit suicide. I didn't have the guts to, but I thought maybe if I sabotaged my career, then I would be just out of this whole situation, right?
That's the exact words I was getting ready to use, is that you were looking for an out. And it could have even to a degree been on a subconscious level, but you were in this sabotaging cycle of, I wanted to kill myself. That didn't work, but you still didn't have any of the relief. You were still feeling the pressures. And so you were behaving in a way, even if subconsciously, that was still looking to remedy all of the pain that you were experiencing, it sounds like.
Exactly. And one thing I didn't mention was I was doing a lot of dangerous things. So at the last 16 years of my career, I was in a narcotic task force. So I was doing anti-drug stuff, right? So when I don't know if your viewers have seen, but when you do a raid on a house, there's like 10 cops and they go up to the house and you're never supposed to go like one to a room, right? You're always two guys go into a room.
Right.
Well, I was doing stupid stuff like going into the room by myself. I did think about this. So this wasn't subconscious. I did think maybe if I go into this room, this guy will shoot me and I will go out a hero, right? Because if you die in the line of duty, you've seen the funerals, right? The funerals are just wonderful. I didn't think about maybe this guy will shoot me in the spine and I'll be in a wheelchair all my life.
Of course not. No rational thinking here.
Of course not. You don't do that. So yes, I believe that wasn't working. This wasn't working. That wasn't working. I mean, again, I'm still, I don't know what subconsciously I was thinking, but I believe that's why. And believe me, I've thought about that for the last 12 years, is wondering what exactly, where did I take that fork in the road, right? Yeah. But I think it's as soon as you start committing sins, the drug use, the lying, the isolating, God didn't create us to be isolated. He created us for community. And so when, like you said earlier, when you get off of God's path, that's when he wants to pull you back, right? And the only way he can pull you back is through adversity. And exactly. God could have stopped all this from happening, but I wouldn't have learned valuable life lessons, and I wouldn't have changed, and I would have been a miserable person, so.
But Norm, before we start to talk a little bit about what you learned during this process, because I can only imagine that there were numerous things that you learned, I want to make sure that the audience don't just listen to this as a story. Don't just listen to this as, oh my gosh, this was fascinating. He was agnostic, now he's Christian. He was a police officer, then he ended up in prison. Like, don't just listen to this as if it's a drama. What I want to make sure that you notice here is that all of us experience adversity on one end of the scale or another. And it's, there's a few things that you're not doing or a few things that you're avoiding doing, you're going to find yourself in a situation where you're going to be doing things that are going to be detrimental to your life, that are going to be detrimental to the lives that are around you. And so, I don't want you to tune out like, oh my gosh, this is a fascinating story, and I've never been through anything like that. I'm just this. Well, whatever your just is, there are still some self-sabotaging behaviors and mindsets that it's so easy to fall into the trap of. And so what you have gone through was a lot more, I'm going to say dramatic, because I can't think of any better word. The average person is not going to have the story that you have, but we all have something that I want to make sure that we recognize how easy it is to fall into the trap of these self-sabotaging behaviors as a result of what it is that we're dealing with and not getting through it. But anyway, I digress. What'd you learn?
Well, that was really well said. Yeah, it's not everybody, depending upon their resilience, everybody responds to the trauma in a different way. So you're exactly right. So I get arrested, and this is where God starts his work, right? I bail out. I'm at home, and of course, I'm a basket case. I'm crying. I know that I'm going to go to prison because I did everything that I was accused of.
Well, of
And
course you knew it. You'd watched what happened to other people for 26
of course,
years.
of course. And all of a
You've
sudden,
seen that movie before.
but here's how God moves, right? I mean, this is why I believe that God chooses the people he wants, right? And so there's a phone call one evening. I answer the phone, and I'm really hesitant because the press was calling, and people that had my phone number were cussing me out and all kinds of stuff. But anyway, this gentleman goes, "Hi, I'm Pastor Jeff. I'm from this church, and I got your number from a friend of your father's. And I just wanted to let you know that we have this church and we do counseling at this church, and you're welcome to come. I believe that we could help you," right? But I'm like, in my mind, right? I'm not saying anything mean, but in my mind, I'm saying, who is this guy? Yeah, okay, yeah. And he says, well, can you come? Will you come to church? I said, well, I don't think so, right? I just said, no, I don't think so. But this is where he's still a friend now, and he tells me that the Holy Spirit put this on him. He asked me if he could pray for me. And I said, sure. In my mind, I'm saying, yeah, knock yourself out. I mean, I don't know how
do
to
whatever
pray.
you have to do so we can get off the phone.
Yeah, so I get off the phone, right? And I don't know anything about prayer. My mom taught me this German prayer one time about Jesus, but I really didn't know how to pray. So he prays the sinner's prayer, and I didn't know what it meant. So at the end, he says, "Do you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior?" And I didn't want to be rude, so I just said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Okay, well, our doors are always open. Feel free to come anytime." So he hangs up. I go back on the couch where my wife's at, and I sit there, and she's looking at me, and she senses something, right? And she goes, "Are you all right?" And I said, I sat there for a second and thought, no, I actually feel better. And she,
Yeah.
what's that all about? And I told her, and it's very difficult to describe. It's not like this come to God moment where, oh my God, now I believe in God, blah, blah, blah. But I felt this weight lifted off my shoulders. And she had grown up Christian, actually Catholic. And she never really argued with me about my beliefs, just because she knew I was really adamant that I don't think there's anything out there.
Yeah.
So she goes, well, maybe we should go to church. And I said, okay, let's try it. I mean, I need something, right? I'm not right in my heart, and I'm not right up here. So I need to do something. We went to church, and now remember, I'm still a cop. If people don't know about cops are very judgmental, right? We have this attitude of us versus them. So in other words, cops versus anybody else, right?
And you're always right, of course.
Yeah, we're always right. If you have a DUI, you're a scumbag. If you ever been arrested for loud music, you're a scumbag. So we go by what crimes you committed, not who you really are or the mistakes you made. And these are some of the things I learned later. But so I go in there, and all these people are in the church are tattooed up, tattoos on their neck, on their face. They got their hats on sideways, shorts, and I'm dressed up. I mean, you got to go to church, you got to dress up,
You're
right?
dressed like you thought you should dress at church.
Yeah. And so I get there, and I'm going, oh my God, what did I get myself into? But these people were the nicest people. They hugged us. I don't think they knew who we were. Welcome, you're a new face. What can we get for you? Where do you want to sit? I mean, I was blown away, right? And then Pastor Jeff, he amazing sermon, and it all spoke to my heart. So I felt more comfortable there that day than I had in ages, right? So we started making it a regular thing. I ended up going to the men's groups, and so my daughter then required to have a biopsy of her liver. So one day, the pastor, right on a Sunday sermon, in the middle of the sermon, he stops. He looks over at me and my family, and he says, I want the whole congregation to pray for her right now. And of course, I start crying. And so the whole congregation prayed for my daughter's healing. And so a week later, I think it was, that we did the biopsy. It was a couple of weeks later that we got the results, and we went to the doctor. And the doctor did another CT scan, and he came in the room and said, I don't know what to say. The tests showed normal liver tumors, or I'm sorry, liver tissue.
Yeah.
And he put up both scans, and the one scan that they did before had the dark spots were the tumors, right? And the new one he did that day was clean. And at
Wow.
first I got angry, right? At first I'm like, do you understand what you put me through? You falsely diagnosed this. He goes, no, 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 hold on. And he had a UCLA Medical Center had a secondary opinion, and it did. It said that that's tumors, and it hit me, right? It was like the Holy Spirit just came on me, and I thought, God healed her. And I think God knew that he had to do something big, big in my life to really believe. Because even though I was going to church and stuff, I was a little bit on the fence because I started to read the Bible. And unfortunately, I started at the Old Testament. It was all the killing and all. And I thought, what kind of God is this, killing
You're
thousands
like,
of
this sounds too much like what I've been doing at work for all these years. That's what got
I
me
don't
in
know if
this
I like
situation.
I don't know if I like this God. But then that was the there was no way I could argue it. And from then on, I just been on fire. And then so a little bit later, I got I pled guilty. I went to jail, and first year I was put in a suicide cell because of my prior suicide attempts.
Mhm.
It was horrible. I mean, it was something that I hope no one ever has to go through, but I was able to study the Bible without interruption. I was able to pray. Yeah, I mean, God knows what he's doing, right?
He
And so
knows
after
what to
that,
use. God knows exactly what it's going to take to get our attention.
yeah, exactly. And so they shipped me off to Fort Worth, Texas, where I did about 4 years out there. And I was really angry, but as soon as I got there, I realized God's got this, right? I go to the chapel there. They hire me for a job right away. And there were some other cops that made some mistakes there. So I kind of had a little bit of protection from, because you have to have at least 3 or 4 guys with you. Otherwise, you can be a victim in prison. But then a seminary came in there, was teaching classes. So I go, okay, all right, God, I got you. I know, okay. So I ended up getting my master's degree in theology and Christian counseling there. And we had a chaplain there that really, I mean, I shouldn't say this, but he really wasn't a people person. It was just a job for him. So
Yeah.
when guys came in to say, listen, I really would like to talk to you, he knew that me and this other guy were going through these counseling courses. So he said, hey, you want to talk to them? You want to learn about counseling here? I mean, it was just, everything was God related, right? I mean, everything, when I look back now, I see his fingerprints on everything.
Yeah.
And that's where I learned about people, right? Even though some of these guys were horrific, horrible people, but I learned what made them tick. I learned the trauma that they've been through. And that's what made me want to really specialize in trauma, because majority, I'd say 99.9% of these people in prison have been through something really, really bad. Now, there are just really bad people.
Yeah, there are some people that are just evil, but there are a
Yes.
lot of people, that when we look at their past, we recognize, well, no wonder.
Exactly.
Look at everything he or she went through and never got any help.
Exactly. So I went through 3 years of secular counseling. I went through 2 years while I was out on bail, and then 1 year in prison. And although they helped me with coping skills, after 3 years, there was no healing, right?
Wow.
And when I got to prison, I was thinking, there's got to be more to it. But then when I was going through these classes, a guy that I met there was from LAPD, and he had done some bad stuff with drugs. But he taught me how to look at the Bible through a different lens, right? I was reading the Bible academically, just like a book, but you really got to read it with your heart, right? You got to go through each chapter and go, okay, what's God trying to tell me? And kind of meditate on it, pray on it a little bit. And it takes a little bit longer to get through, but the message comes out clear as day. And so I began to learn all the spiritual principles. And with this guy, Ruben, we went through a process of confession, repentance, renunciation, going back to the root cause of my issues, so we tracked back the root cause. And then all the sinful things that I did after these little traumatic events were all sinful, right? I mean, we never cope with things really in a proper manner. And we're not taught how to do that as kids. Maybe we should have a class in school saying, hey, this is how you deal with depression. This is how. But anyway, about 4 or 5 months in, all my PTSD symptoms were gone. I mean, we spent a lot of time praying, meditating, confessing all the things that I did. It was difficult. It wasn't easy, having to go back and admit the things that I did and really face things that I should have forgiven that I was holding on to, stopping the judgment of people, all these things. And since that time, I think it was like 14, I have not had a PTSD symptom since.
That's
And
phenomenal.
so they shipped me off to a minimum security after that, which is here in California, by Santa Barbara. And it's a camp. So there's really no locks on the doors and stuff. So it was a little bit more relaxing. It wasn't more like a prison. But then I ended up getting my doctorate degree in Christian counseling and my certificates in alcohol and drug counseling, because I knew that was the coping mechanism that I used that really put me in a bad spot.
Yeah.
And so I ended up, my dissertation was about trauma, how what God says about healing trauma, the principles that the Bible lays out for healing trauma. And I put that, and I actually made that a book. And so I was 8 years into my sentence, and then COVID came, and COVID was really bad for a lot of people. But
Yeah.
for me, it was a godsend. I know that God did this. He let me out of prison 3.5 years early.
Oh, awesome.
It's crazy, right? 3.5 years. And so I got a job as an addiction counselor and a chaplain. And so now I'm trying to spread the word that there is healing.
Yeah.
And
So we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want us to share some of the do's and don'ts, if you will, with the audience, if they might find themselves going through some form of disruption. So we'll be right back. This episode is brought to you by the free guide, When God Says Shift. Inside, you'll discover the 4 shifts required to reveal God's plan to ditch disruption or delay and get his blessings faster. Head to GodSaysShift.com to access it now. All right. So like I was saying before the break, we all are experiencing or have experienced or will experience some form of disruption, some unexpected circumstance, some form of adversity. And so God allows these things to happen in our lives for a reason. It tells us in Romans that all things work together for the good of those that love the Lord. And it's because the things that he allows to happen in our lives, he really ultimately desires for them to be a tool that moves our lives forward. But too often, and you probably see this even more than I do, is not only just in a ministerial role, but also, as an addiction counselor, so oftentimes the things that God really intends to be a tool in our lives to develop us actually becomes something that keeps us stuck or destroys us. And so the first question that I want to ask you, Norm, is what have you seen are some of the common barriers that actually keeps a person from taking the adversity, taking the disruption, and allowing it to be a tool that moves them forward instead of something that keeps them stuck?
Well, the first thing to understand is that it's not really the traumatic event that keeps us oppressed, right? It's our response to that event.
Yes.
So, yeah. So if something happens, like say a really bad car wreck, and all of a sudden, you're freaked out and you don't want to go in a car, and every time somebody brings this up, you get this anxiety, and if you don't deal with that anxiety properly, in other words, okay, I'm going to have a drink, or I'm going to have a couple drinks before I get in the car, then you're losing your fellowship with God. So if you're in fellowship with God, that means you're sin free, right? And we're never sin free, but we're caught up with repentance. But every time we commit a sin, we lose that fellowship, right? And not that God doesn't love us anymore. It just disrupts our relationship until we confess, repent, and restore that relationship. So what happens to us is we end up going our own way, right? We end up deciding our own what's good for us. So okay, we have a divorce and my spouse cheated on me, so I'm going to be vindictive. I'm going to get her back.
Yeah.
I'm going to love another woman again. I'm just going to use them. All these things are sinful, right? I mean, we don't think of it at the time, but we get wrapped up in our own anger.
Yeah.
So when you do a spiritual cleansing, that's when everything comes together and you restore that fellowship with God. So the worst thing that we could do is fight God, right? We never believe at the very beginning that this is something that's for our benefit. We always think it's detrimental to our lives. But if you, so that's the first thing. The second thing is understanding who God is and who he sees us as, right? Because if you don't truly believe, you see God as a mean father that just wants to be vindictive, we'll never heal, right?
Yeah.
But if you understand, like how you explained it is exactly right. Matter of fact, later on in the year, I got another book coming out, Why God Allows Suffering.
Yes.
And the Bible tells it. And just like you said, is that there's several reasons, and all of them are really designed to bring you to be closer to him through being more Christ-like. He's preparing us for heaven.
Well, and to be able to help other people, because
Of course. Yeah.
you're now, it was, I liken it to when I was pregnant. I did not want a male OBGYN doctor that might have been a great student, but never in his life had he experienced what I experienced. I wanted a woman who had experienced what I had experienced. So even when you look at what God allowed to happen in your life, you're going to be so much more effective in reaching and helping the people that have been through what it is that you've been through, because you've been through it, versus you read it in a book, you did some class, you did some studies, you did some internships, you read a few journals. No, like you'll be able to speak directly to, what it is that people are experiencing. And I think that that's one of the things that I'm always on my soapbox about, is that it didn't happen to you, it happened for you. But oftentimes it also happened for other people as well. But most of us don't even get to that point, that we realize the benefit that it was intended for our own lives or for other people's lives, because we don't respond appropriately. And I love that you use the word respond, because that's the word that I use.
Mhm.
Like when I pitch myself to be interviewed, I always say, everyone has gone through something. Everyone's lives have been disrupted. And the Bible even tells us, consider it not strange when you go through these trials. But I feel that many churches don't do a great job of equipping us, number one, of understanding why the disruption happened in our lives, and number two, how to respond appropriately. We're told all the times, like, you can't control other people, but you can control how you respond. Well, it's the exact same thing with disruption. Oftentimes we may not be able to control the disruption that comes into our lives, especially if it's something that God wants to be there. But how are you going to respond? Because I said at the top of the hour that God uses disruption to get our attention. Once he has our attention, he can invite us into what it is that he has planned. But we can't respond to the invitation until we first respond to what he used to get our attention. And so I love that you talked about, like, how are you going to respond when something happens? I love that.
Yeah, because adversity can either just totally devastate you, or it can be the catalyst for growth. And by understanding who God is, just like you just said, and how he operates and how he works, and believing in Romans 8:28, like you just said, that, okay, even though I'm going through a very difficult time in my life, if I love God, everything will work for the good. In other words, just like you said, it's in Corinthians where it says, God brings you through so you can help others. He's bringing, he cares more about our future in heaven than he does our comfort in this world.
Yes.
So these are the things that we have to understand. But when I was going through it, I was like, why me? Oh my God, why me? Why are you doing, even though I didn't believe, God, why are you doing this to me? It's because of just a lack of understanding. And that's what I tried to explain in the book, is that first you got to have, so the first part of it is a Bible study, right? You have to understand who God is, his attributes. You got to understand what he thinks of you. And you have to believe those biblical references to, I am beautiful and wonderfully made, I am a God's child. because when you believe in that, then you could believe the rest of the promises in the Bible.
Yeah. So as we begin to wrap this conversation up, Norm, where can our listeners follow you on social media? What are your social media handles?
On Facebook, it's Christ-centered healing. On Instagram, it's Christ_centered_heal. And on my webpage is Christ-centeredhealing.com. Christ-centeredhealing.com.
Perfect. And the links to that will be in the show notes. But before we go, tell us in about 30 seconds, what's the title of the book and what is the primary thing that will change our lives, that our lives will be different because we've read it. There we go.
The name of the book is Christ-Centered Healing of Trauma. And the secondary is Healing a Broken Heart, because that's what trauma is. It breaks our heart, right? But God is the one who created our heart. He is the only one that could heal it. And what it will teach you is these biblical principles. It'll teach you why we should believe God is actually real by going through this Bible study and how he sees you and all these things, so that you could believe in God. And then we talk about trauma. What is trauma? How it affects the physiology and stuff like that. And then it goes to talking about our emotions, what our emotions are for, and how we misuse them. And at the very end, there's a series of a bunch of prayers that will just change your life.
And is the best place for them to get the book on your website?
Well, you can go through my website. It's through a publisher. So the publisher's web address is Christ-centeredhealingbook.com.
Okay.
Christ-centeredhealingbook.com, or it's on Amazon.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you sharing these nuggets. Everyone, I pray that this episode has blessed you and that you will consider going back and listening to previous and future episodes as well. Everyone have a great day. Bye-bye.